Dr. Nirav Shah, and Mike Welke from the CDC, US CDC, head of pandemic preparedness. So we're going to be talking about the question of, are we prepared for the next pandemic? So these are free. We offer 1 hour CME, and so you're welcome to join us for the next one as well. And we'll be reconvening them in the fall. So without further ado, we're just extraordinarily honored to have Dr. Bob Putnam. I met him back in the 90s. He doesn't remember it, but I was a student getting my MPH from Harvard, and I took a course over at the Kennedy School and got to hear him, and he was pretty provocative. So I remembered it over all these years. And then about 3 years ago, I was at I read his book, The Bowling Alone, and the Upswing, and then ran into my friend Barrett Takesian at the Putnam Community Squash, and I said, "Wow, how do you have such a diverse group of people here? And it's such a lot of wonderful social bridging and all that." And he says, "Well, one of our mentors who helps us to inform our theory of change here at Portland Community Squash is Bob Putnam." So it was really exciting to hear his name again, and Join or Die, his movie, I've watched now, I think 3 or 4 times, and we did a showing of it this last winter at MaineHealth and all of our different local hospital healthcare systems. So anyway, but you're not here to hear me, but I just wanted to introduce our very, very honored to have this somebody of his stature. He's really part of the premier sociologist in the world. So we're very excited to have him join us at MaineHealth, and he's not that far away in New Hampshire. So thank you, Bob. I'm going to pass the baton over to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Dora. Thank you for somebody just put in the chat line the names of these books. Thank you for saying that. Thank you for referring to this documentary, which bizarrely has gotten a whole lot of awards, and so now my wife Rosemary and I are sort of mini celebrities, and it's a strange feeling for an academic to be on the Daily Show and be interviewed by Trevor Noah, and so on. I should say also, Dora, that, as you know, I told you this, I actually know Maine pretty well, even as a scholar, because we did a whole lot of work on Lewiston back in the day when Lewiston welcomed in quotation marks the Somali immigrants, and Maine's next door to New Hampshire, obviously. So I feel I'm with friends here, and I'm going to be now talking with you about and maybe we could put up the PowerPoint. We can put that up, and I can, for a while, I'll talk, but we can have the PowerPoint in the background. I don't yet see it. Is it up yet?
Libby, do you want to put up the PowerPoint? Thank you. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay. I'm going to be talking here about, most of the time, I'm going to be talking about research that I have done over the last half century, my last half century, and looks at the history of America over the last 125 years. So going back a long ways. But I'm going to be beginning with where we are right now. I mean, just open today's newspaper, and we're talking, almost all of us are talking about, well, at least all the newspapers are talking about the Trump administration. So we have the next slide. I've been assured that it isn't the end of the world if I talk about politics here. You guys don't have to agree with me, but I'm a political scientist after all. So I want to start a little bit with the last national election we had last November. And a lot of people are talking about it as if it was some very unusual, exceptional election. It wasn't at all. It was a completely normal election. Some people, especially the administration, talk about it as a landslide. It was nothing like a classic landslide. A landslide is like when FDR won by 24%, and that brought us a New Deal because he had a big mandate for a big change, and he had a huge electoral victory. And LBJ is another example of a big landslide, won by 24 percentage points in 1964 over Barry Goldwater. big mandate, and that led to big changes. The Great Society, Medicare, Medicaid, civil rights. Reagan, this is not just a member of Democrats. Reagan won by 18% in 1984, and that led to the Reagan Revolution. So those are landslides that led to big changes, and Trump is barely, is not even roughly a tenth of that, or less than a tenth of those, and he doesn't have any mandate at all. It was just, and it doesn't matter whether you look at raw vote or look at the Electoral College. This was an ordinary election, despite what you might hear. And moreover, it was about the key issue. Everybody agrees the key issue was economics, and that's always true, almost always. And that's also normal. And when the economy turns, as maybe it's beginning to turn, the political pendulum reverses. So it was not as in itself an unusual election. I mean, the aftermath is quite unusual, but that's a different matter. Let's go to the next slide, however, because what I really want to say is that in historical perspective, the 2024 election last November was a major signpost. And that's what I'm now going to be widening my frame to look beyond just what happened last November. Trump did not create the America we have, the polarized, atomized America. He exploited it. And that's not just Bob Putnam saying that. Steve Bannon, Trump's guru, has revealed who his guru was, and it's me. Because Steve Bannon has said publicly in the last month or two that when I wrote Bowling Alone about declining social capital, that is connections among people, about increasing social isolation, that became the basis of Trump's political strategy, because they guessed correctly that the people in places in America who are most socially isolated would be ripe for a authoritarian populist appeal. That was true, and they got it. So if you want to know who brought you Trump, here I am. I'm not proud of that fact, and it's true. Actually, it's not just that Bannon and I think that. There's a lot of good evidence that the best predictor for who voted for Trump or where Trump got his edge, it's where there's low social capital. Low social capital is just my jargon for saying places where people are not connected in various kinds of social networks. I'll say a little bit more about what I mean by that. But so here's the problem. The real historical threat is not the 2024 election itself. It's revealed by the 2024 election, and there are two parts to it. There's growing social isolation, which is in my jargon for that is low social capital, growing social isolation, and a growing class gap. And that has been shown in two of my books that I want to talk about a little bit now. So now I'm suddenly going to move from being a pundit about what's happening every day in America to an academic talking about two of my books that I believe are an important, crucial part of the background to where we are right now. So let's have the next slide. The next slide is the cover for a book I published now about probably 5 years ago, called The Upswing, which I published jointly with Shayla Romney Garrett, another New Hampshire resident. And let's have the next slide, because this is what the book is about. If we can have the next slide. My mom would have said, America's in a pickle. That is, we are in 4 different ways really awful, in very historically rare levels of, first of all, political polarization. America has almost never been as polarized politically as we are now. The closest call to that is the 5 years between 1860 and 1865. And if you know your history, you know that's the American Civil War. Well, we're not quite there yet, but that's the only time we've been even close to where we are now in levels of political polarization, the gap between Republicans and Democrats. And independently of that, we're also at historic levels of economic inequality. It's not just Elon Musk, although he illustrates the point, but the gap between rich and poor in America has basically never been as great. There's a close call in the period around what's sometimes called the Gilded Age at the end of the 19th century, but even that's probably we're even more unequal than we were then. So we're really very unequal. And we're also, it's harder to measure social isolation, but probably we've never been as isolated socially as we are now. And we're more self-centered in cultural terms. And I'll say what I mean by that in a minute. So the question I first want to ask is, how did we get here? And then let's go to the next slide. And if you like numbers, your time has come. I'm going to show you some charts. And if you don't like numbers, that's okay. Just settle back and close your eyes, and I'll talk. And if I say anything interesting, then you can open your eyes and look at the slides. So now all the slides basically are going to look like this. Let me explain it a little bit. The horizontal axis is between roughly the end of the 19th century, roughly 1890. 1895, roughly, and it ends now. Now, these charts all are drawn from a book that was published in 2020, so the actual data only only come forward till about 2015. But actually, in every single case, and I won't repeat this all the time, and we now know what the level of polarization or economic inequality or whatever is. We know what it is, and it's in every case, it's now below the bottom of the chart. So it's not gotten better. It's gotten worse in the last decade since we gathered all these data. So that's the horizontal axis, roughly 1895 to roughly now. And the vertical axis here is one of these four measures of politics and economics and so on. And here we're starting with politics. And the vertical, I've oriented it so that up is always good. Up in this case means bipartisanship, political comedy, getting along politically. And so what you can see now is the dots are individual years, and then I've smoothed it out with the red line, so you can see the general trend. And as you can see, in the late 19th century, America was very polarized, extremely polarized. And remember what I just finished saying, the only time ever in American history when we were that polarized, and where we are, we're now even more polarized than we were in 1895, and you have to go back 1860-65 to find any numbers that approximate where we have gotten now. But then as you see at the beginning of the 20th century, we began to become a little less polarized and a little more cooperative across party lines. We still were pretty polarized, but the trend was going in the up direction, and it continued going up for the next 50, 60 years. And so you can see it went up during the teens and 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s and into the middle 50s. You're all too young to remember the middle 50s. I'm old. I'm 84 years old, so I certainly remember that. And the president at that time was a guy named Dwight Eisenhower. A few of you will have heard of Dwight Eisenhower in your history courses. And Dwight Eisenhower, except for George Washington, Dwight Eisenhower was the least partisan president we've ever had. He was actually considered for nomination by both Republicans and the Democrats. Dwight Eisenhower did not cause that. He reflected it. It was a period in which Americans were very cooperative across party lines, and most big bills in that era were passed by majorities of both parties. It was, get along with one another. But then as we got into the 70s, and especially in the 80s and 90s, and then it just keeps dropping, we became ever more polarized. The gap between the Republicans and the Democrats and the degree of cooperation between Republicans and Democrats began to vanish. And now we're back way down there. And as I said, if I showed you the data up to 2025, where we are now, it breaks the bottom of the graph. Do I control this? Oh, I do. Can you see me moving the marker or not? Yes. Not if you can see me move. Oh, great. So I can.
Yeah.
Oh, great.
So
perfect. That's great. I will. So this is that long arc. And here's Eisenhower up here. Very little difference between the parties. And here's where we are now. And back in the 1860s, we were even lower. That's the Civil War. Okay, that's politics. Now, the other graphs all sort of have the same basic shape here, so I can be quicker. This is economics. This is basically the gap between rich folks and poor folks. And all of these charts have behind them, I'm not boring you with the methodological details, all of them have behind them, each of them has maybe a dozen different measures. So here we're looking at economic quality, meaning income differences or before taxes or after taxes, wealth differences before taxes or after taxes, chances of upward mobility, the chances that poor children can make it to the top. All those measures, they all tell the same story. This here, strictly speaking, this begins in 1914 because that's when the IRS was created, and that is when we begin to have really seriously good data on income distribution in America. But we know with less perfect precision what the inequality was back in this earlier period, and it was very low. I mean, equality was very low. This is the Gilded Age, in which on the Upper East Side lived the Rockefellers and Carnegies and so on, and on the Lower East Side lived the poor huddled masses. So we're not down there yet, but we're close, because remember, as I said, if we get to 2025 over here, this graph it looked as if this is the Obama years. It looked maybe as if finally we're stopped getting more unequal, but no, now we're down about there. So that's economic equality over these years. How about, as you see, it looks a little bit like the other graph. We start off in a bad place, and then we seem somehow gradually to get in a much better place, and then it turns up here around, roughly speaking, in around 1961, 62 is the turning point, and that's when I personally started to vote. And so a plausible hypothesis here is that Bob Putnam, by voting, caused the collapse of American civilization. But there are other hypotheses, and we'll get to those other things that might explain it. But if in doubt, blame me for all the trouble we're in now. So let's go back to, now we're going to go forward to social cohesion, that's another term for what I call social capital, but you don't need the jargon. It just means, how well do we know our neighbors? How close is our family? Are we involved in community organizations like PTAs or Rotary Club, or do we trust one another? All those, they all have basically the same pattern. So we can put them in one graph here. And again, now it's beginning to look a little familiar. Back in the 1890s, America, we had just been through the Industrial Revolution, and the Industrial Revolution meant that millions of Americans moved from farms and villages, whether the farms and villages were in Iowa or were in, southern Italy or in Russia. They just moved from there, and they left all their family and friends and community organizations behind, and they just moved to the big city, whether that was Chicago or New York or whatever. And they lacked connections with people. That's how it happened that we were down there and didn't know our neighbors. But then, as you see, beginning in the early 20th century, that began to change. Not immediately, not overnight, because you don't change these big things overnight, but steadily we began to become more connected. We began to know our neighbors a little bit better. We began to trust them. And by the time you get to my childhood, which was up here in the 1950s, basically people trusted other people, astonishingly. Back then, in about where my arrow is now, about 2/3 of Americans said they trusted other people to do what was right. And that figure is not 2/3, but it's back 1/3. So most of us now don't trust our neighbors. When I was growing up in a small town in Ohio in the 1950s, we didn't lock our doors. And when I tell my grandchildren now who are growing up over here that we didn't lock their doors, I mean, they trust Grandpa, but they think he must have been smoking something, because how could you ever not lock your door? They've been growing up, this is the point, they've grown up in a completely different America. And this graph traces that. So now let's go to the last of these 4 slides that we've done. What have we done? Politics and economics and society. Now we're going to do culture. And I won't take time now to spell out exactly what I mean by culture, but the basic idea is, do we think we're all in this together? And then we think that basically the Americans have a lot in common, and we should worry about all of us? Or do we think, no, we're really, everybody's in it for themselves, and I better take care of me and not worry about other people? To what extent, in other words, down here at the end of the 19th century, we were very much an I society. Basically, most Americans worried about themselves only and thought they should. Their moral conviction was that we should just care for yourself and don't care for other people. Up here, that was reversed, and we had a kind of a we society in which everybody said, I am my brother's keeper, and I have obligations to God, but then also I have obligations to my neighbor, to love thy neighbor as I love myself. That was the culture up here, but then it plunged down, and this is getting boring, the same pattern. Now we're back down to this I society in which, well, it's emblematic that we've elected a leader now twice who says it's about me. I'm the one. Well, that's exactly what the culture has given us. Trump didn't cause that. He's a result of the fact that we're now living in an era in which that's the dominant culture. So let's see if we can move forward quickly here. And whoops, come on, move forward. I just put all those graphs together, and you can see it's astonishing actually that one single line you're looking at it summarizes all of economic change and political change and social change and cultural change in America. It's an amazingly, I'm not going to give you the statistics, but it's astonishing how closely all these fit together. So, it passes what statisticians sometimes called the interocular trauma test. Interocular, it hits you between the eyes that something's going on here. And so something must have happened. Now, let's go to the next slide. I mean, you see what's basically, here we were an I society, but somehow we got out of it. And now we're back in an I society, but so this is meant to be a sort of an optimistic chart. We're here, we'd like not to be here, we'd like to be going up someplace, but these people actually did it. So the one thing this graph tells you is it isn't impossible. We're not stuck forever in this graph. At least they got out of it, so we ought to be able to get out of it. Let's have the next slide. Let's see. Oh, yeah, there's another related point I want to make here. I said earlier that there were two things that empirical work has shown has been happening in recent decades. The first of all is increasing social isolation, and now you've seen that, a lot of evidence on that. But the other thing I said was that this is class biased, which means the growth of social isolation is greater among less educated Americans, people who didn't finish college, and it's greater in that part of the class spectrum and less among college educated Americans. I would wish we were sitting in the same room so I could ask you whether you have a college degree, but I'm betting that most of you have a college degree, and you may not know it, but just having a college degree puts you in the upper third of American society. And so I don't mean you're rich, but you're pretty well off compared to other folks in Maine or New Hampshire or Idaho or whatever. And what this graph is saying is you may have a few fewer friends than other people in Maine, but most Mainers, is Maine the right term, or should I say Mainlanders? No, Mainers.
Mainers.
So most Mainers are way more socially isolated than you are. That's the main point to take away from this guy. You are in a privileged, you may not think of yourself as privileged, but you're in a privileged category of Maine, folks in Maine, because you still have at least some friends. According to this graph, which is nationwide, you're down a little bit in having close friends, and you're up a little bit in being completely isolated, but not as way less than most of your fellow Maine folks. So that's another important part of the story, and you'll see why in a minute. Let me go forward now. So we've got a democratic crisis going on here, and I'm just going to try to summarize. Now I'm back to the part of this graph, and I'm a little over time, but we took a little bit of time getting started, so I'm maybe not too far behind, and I am getting close to the end here, and I want to leave time for Q&A and so on, and objections. So I think there are three fundamental causes of our democratic democracy. Remember, way back in the beginning, we agreed, or at least I think we agreed, I tried to persuade you, we're in a crisis of our democracy. I mean, a serious crisis. And there are lots of things that play into that, but the three fundamental causes of this are, first of all, we have a shriveled sense of we. We're much more an I society, just like they were 125 years ago. We think about us. We don't worry about other people in we don't worry about cooperating with people politically. Indeed, we think that's cooperation is a bad idea, most of us. We don't worry about their economics. We think it's up to them, and you know, if they're poor, well, that's their tough luck. It's hard to believe, but that's where we are. That's what the data show. And secondly, this sense of isolation is class-based. It's not just that everybody in America is more isolated. It's the lower you are in the hierarchy, the less education you have, the more likely you are to be. And then keep in mind, most Americans are in that category. 2/3 or maybe more of Mainers today are not in the privileged position you are. I keep saying that because I know you don't think of yourselves as privileged. I don't think of myself as privileged, but boy, am I privileged. And my grandchildren are privileged. And so are your children and grandchildren. I mean, I'm sorry to be giving you the straight story, but that's just true. And finally, this cause is not just about economics. It's about whether we on the top even recognize the people on the bottom. It's not just about economics. It's how do we convey that we actually see them as real people? And I want to come back to that in a second. Oops. Okay. So now let me go back just a second here. So here we are back to the chart, basic chart of the history of the last 125 years. And most people who look at this graph ask about, well, what happened up there? And the short answer is the 60s happened, but that's not the most interesting question, because it wasn't a perfect society and we wouldn't want to go back there. The relevant question to us here is over here, because we're over here, our society is very polarized, unequal, and so on. But they were in that situation and they got out of it. So this is the whole point I've been leading up to. What did they know that we would like to know? Is it clear? We should be now asking ourselves, what lessons can we learn from the folks who successfully made it out of a trap just like the one we're in? And that is actually the real point of the book called The Upswing. And the point of that book, whoops, come on, go forward. Here's the 4 lessons. There are lots of lessons, but I want to give you these are the 4 lessons that Shailene Romney Garrett and I take away from that last Upswing. What can we learn from those folks who were caught just as we are caught and who nevertheless managed to get out of it? First of all, that upswing, which in historical terms is called the progressive era, that was driven by young people. It was old folks kind of knew that things were bad. Old folks today know, like me, I mean, I know this better because I actually lived it. I know America doesn't have to be this way. My grandchildren don't even know that. But I'm not the kind of person who's going to be able to figure out what do we need to do in order to make a better place, make America a better place in, I don't know, 2050. I'm going to be long dead and I don't have the right vibes, to use the language they use. So in the last time, the same thing was true. It was young Americans, a lot of them. The guy who invented Rotary Club, for example, was a kid. We think of Rotary as kind of old-fashioned, but when it was invented by a guy who was 22 years old and just moved to Chicago, and he was lonely, and he thought maybe I could start a lunch club with other people. We could just get together and hang out. I'd be a little less socially isolated. And that guy, within 20 or 30 years, millions of people all over the world were having lunch every, whatever it is, Tuesday, because of that one bright idea by that one young kid in Chicago in about 1890. Next, this was not only was the upswing driven by young people, it was bottom up. It was not top down. It was led by people at the grassroots. And what do I mean by that? I mean, the ideas that turned out to be important were invented not by people at Harvard, certainly not Harvard, not by people in Washington. They were invented by ordinary folks in ordinary communities across America. Let me give you one example. I know I'm running out of time here, but I want to give you one example because it's such a neat example. The most important social invention of the last couple hundred years, actually, wait for it, was the invention of the public high school. Now, you all probably thought God invented the public high school back in the year 06 or something. But no, I mean, we had secondary schools. They were private schools, or they were exam schools like the Boston Latin. Those had been around for some time, but they weren't for everybody. They were just for a few kids. Either the very talented or the very wealthy went to private schools, private secondary schools. The real invention was the idea that every kid in town, just because they were a kid in town, got 4 years of secondary education. Pretty amazing. Where did it happen? Not Washington, not where the idea came from, not Harvard. It came from flyover country, small towns in middle America, in, I don't know, Kansas or Nebraska or Iowa. And now you got to imagine, you're sitting in Iowa, it's around 1910, and you're worried about your kids you're all farmers or local shopkeepers, but you can see this in the Industrial Revolution coming on, and where are they going to get the training so that they will survive in this new world? Well, public high school, but who's going to pay for it? Well, the local rich people. I mean, there are not many rich people in Sioux City, or I don't know, East Elbow, Iowa, but these people felt a sense of obligation to other people's kids. That's an important part of it. They thought, I have an obligation to other people's kids so that the whole town can prosper. And so rich people who had already sent their own kids off to other, their kids had gone to some private secondary school someplace, and they were now off in Chicago making money, but they felt enough sense of obligation to other people and to other people's kids that they paid higher tax. They chose to pay higher taxes so that every kid could have a free secondary education. Okay. So what? What's the big deal? Well, it was a huge deal because it was, and I'm now quoting a woman who won the Nobel Prize a couple of years ago for this discovery. Having a high school education, that is the fact that America was the first place in the world to have public high schools, accounts for more than all of America's economic growth in the whole of the 20th century. We had a way better educated working class well into the 50s and 60s. Remember, this was invented in 1910, but for the next 50 years, we were way ahead of everybody else. It wasn't because we won the war. It wasn't because we had, good natural resources. This is because we had chosen to invest in young people who then became older people. And as they became older people, they raised the level of our productivity a ton. Okay. That's grassroots innovation. I'm sorry I went on so long, but I wanted to say it's not just tiddlywinks that people were learning to play in these small towns. This was a bottom-up exercise. And next, and I want to come back to this in a second, of all these various things that were leading, which of these graphs was the one that was the leading? Where did this start first? Where did all these changes start first? And to my shock, I was sure I knew it. I thought it was all about economics. Somehow the economic problems would get fixed, and then eventually, the social culture the social connections would get fixed, and morals and so on. But no, that's not right. What the evidence shows, and the evidence I'm not going to lay out for you now, but it's in the book, The Upswing. There was a moral revolution in America. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not talking about, sexual morals. That's not the point I'm talking about. I'm talking about just fundamental morals right out of the Bible, right out of what Christians call the Old Testament. I mean, you got two obligations, God says. I've forgotten which book of the Old Testament it is, but he says, love thy God and love thy neighbor as thyself. I mean, that's it. Love thy neighbor as thyself. That's a very simple idea. And these folks, and it was certainly picked up in the New Testament. I mean, read the Sermon on the Mount. Every verse of the Sermon on the Mount is not about how we ought to worry about ourselves. It's about how we ought to care for other people. So, in any event, that has powerful implications. If you believe me on this, or if you trust me, and I know this is a good group, so you're going to trust me. That means that's how they got out of it, and that means we have to figure out how to ways to convince ourselves and especially our young people that they have obligations to other people. They did not create this problem. My grandchildren, you know, didn't even exist in our imaginations back when we were high and well off, so they didn't cause this problem. History has just given them the challenge, historical challenge, of changing the direction. And in order to do that, they've got to worry about other people. Now, as it happens, my grandchildren have heard me lecture about 1 million times on this, so they're going to be all right. But we need more than just my 7 grandchildren to get this moving. And lastly, and this is, I don't mean to be dismissing this, the we that created in the middle 1950s and in the 1960s was a we for sure, but it was not inclusive enough. It actually, people often think there was a gender bias, but it wasn't. Women, except for a very brief period because of the baby boom, women have always been catching up to men and now are long past men by most measures of health and education, and they're getting close on even hourly income. But there was a racial, certainly, we did not do a whole lot to help. We did too little to help racial minorities and especially African Americans. So I'm praising this period of the 60s and this upswing because I think it's really important for the country as a whole, but I don't ever want to lose track of the fact that this time, if we do get around to fixing the problem this time, we need to include everybody of all religions and political persuasions and especially race. Okay, so this is a kind of a summary. It's the central problem here, I think, is cultural, not just economics. The central problem is cultural, first of all, in the sense that we may not feel this way to you, but the question is, how does it feel this way to other people? Educated progressives, like me, seem to be looking down our noses at what Hillary Clinton called the deplorables. I still am a big fan and a personal friend of Hillary Clinton, so I'm not deploring her exactly, but that was tone deaf for her to talk with, because it conveyed a sense that, you know, these other folks, and we got to be, it's not just raising the income of less well off, we've got to raise their understanding of our appreciation for them as moral beings. And secondly, as I've said before, the central cause of the problem here is cultural or moral. Okay, whoops, I've gone too quickly. Well, let me and I see there's lots of good questions and suggestions in the chat file. This is what I think is the bottom line of everything I've told you. It comes from Teddy Roosevelt, in the first progressive era, the fundamental rule around national life, the rule which underlies all the others, is that on the whole and in the long run, we shall go up or down together. Now, I want to contrast that with a very similar statement by one of our leaders today. I think he's still one of our leaders. Elon Musk, not so long ago, said the fundamental weakness of Western civilization is empathy. I mean, come on, empathy is a weakness? That is just, we're back in that Gilded Age. I mean, it's just, you may be fans of Elon Musk, and maybe he's a smart guy, he certainly is a wealthy guy, but come on, talk about lack of understanding of our obligations to other people. Okay, well, let's end with that slide. That's the more uplifting one. I'm done, and I don't want to end the event. I want to sort of get rid of this, or maybe we should just leave this slide up as the last slide, but let's have some questions and answers. And I'm a little over time, but we got started a little late, so.
You're doing great. No, this is fine. I did, and your friend Barrett Takesian, I think, is one of the first questions. A lot of wonderful comments. He asked, how can we articulate that social connection, how social connection improves the health of Mainers? How can we clearly articulate how social connection improves the health of Mainers?
Got it.
And maybe, Libby, do you want to take the slides down so we can see each other a little bit more? That would be great. You know, this is a great slide to end on, too.
At least for now, I'd like to try. Oh, that's great. Thank you for getting.
Oh, there's Barrett. Barrett's actually got his hand raised. So, Barrett, why don't you ask yourself?
I do.
Sorry.
Hi, Barrett. I want to for a while at least, I'd like to take individual questions because then I can focus on that question. First of all, that there are, let me distinguish, there are effects of social connections on our physical health and mental health, and there are effects of social capital on the health of our democracy. And both of those are important. The external effect on democracy, I care a lot about that, but you're in the health business, and so the part that's relevant to you, maybe most, is the effects of connections on your life. And here I have to say, I was one of the first people to notice it, but now it's now, the following rule is true. Your chances of dying, well, your chances of dying are high, but your chances of dying over the next year are cut in half by joining one group, cut in 3/4 by joining two groups. As a risk factor for premature death, social isolation, by which I mean just not knowing your neighbors or not being involved in Rotary or whatever. Social isolation is as big a risk factor for death for premature death as smoking. So if you smoke and don't belong to any groups, well, first of all, if you smoke, like sure, you got to join a couple of groups to make up for that fact. And so that's really a fact. And so no doubt you're talking to your fellow Mainers about not smoking. I mean, that's the first thing you say to people, don't smoke, that's bad for your health. And now you should say it is also bad for your health if you don't belong to any groups. Social capital in that sense is hugely important. Now, a really good question on which this is an area, by the way, of active research, very active research, mostly in schools of public health, but in more generally, it's even in medical schools, it's a subject of rapid research. What is it about connecting with other people? Part of it is simply, a safety net. If you go to church every Sunday and then you fall in a bathtub, someone's more likely to come and save you and notice that you're not in church than if you didn't go to church. So I'm using that as there is a safety net factor to knowing other people, but that's not the most important thing. The most important thing actually turns out to be biochemical. That is, being around other people. There's really interesting research on this. Being around other people turns out to generate chemicals in our blood that actually give us, astonishingly, actually, all cause death. It's not just that it's good against cancer or heart disease or falling. It's good. It's quite a remarkable effect. So now you may want to talk to other. Well, I guess Dora, you probably know this literature because you got your master's in public health at Harvard. I think you told me that. And but what I'm really want to say is, and now he's disappeared from my screen. What I really want to say is, this is it ought to be an easy sell for you because it's for sure true.
Yeah, and Dr. Vivek Murthy talks about loneliness and social isolation also as a severe, having a severe health impact. So you're backed. I mean, what you're saying is also backed up by other people. So it may sound provocative to someone, here, but actually there's others, as you said, a lot of literature that backs it up. And Barrett, you had your hand raised and I saw you a minute, but I don't see you now. If you're still on and you'd like to say something, talk, would be great. Yeah, hi there, Barrett. Thank you for joining us.
Barrett, you're muted.
On, Barrett, sorry.
You're muted.
You're still muted. Oh, I'm so sorry.
Oh.
And for those who don't know, Barrett is the head of...
I hate the idea of muting Barrett, but I honestly, if we spend much time on any single question, we're never going to get around. So,
well, Barrett, if you get it to work, like say something, let us know, and we'll get to. And I don't know if Libby has any magic she can run from her area to unmute you, but and I don't know if we have this problem. Can everybody else unmute themselves? I don't know. Somebody else had their hand raised, so we can try it with them. Who else had their hand raised electronically? I saw somebody and I can't see you now.
Okay, turns out I got a message that the organizer, which I guess is Libby or maybe Ellen, is the one who's got it.
Yeah, you need to unmute. Can you just unmute everybody and then we can kind of figure it out, or allow people to unmute? Sorry about that.
But it's not only that. Honestly, I think I've done this a lot. I think it's only going to work if one of the directors, you, Dora, or Libby, or Ellen,
I think
articulates the
and
question.
Ellen, you do that?
Articulates the question.
Libby, have you tried to unmute everybody? And it's not working still. And Barrett, can you unmute yourself again or try to? Yeah, and it doesn't work.
Oh, I'm
It looks
good
like
now.
it's working now.
There we go. Thank you.
It just,
Thank you.
just came on. Thank you, Dr. Putnam, so much. I love the smoking statistic and social isolation. Just to finish that question, I think MaineHealth has a responsibility for telling the positive side of this story. If you could tell the flip, not the it'll kill you, but what, how would you articulate that?
Easy. It's easy, Barrett. Forgive me.
Yeah.
I will answer quickly, but I also, forgive me, want to insist that we gotta, our time is limited here, and if we spend a lot of time on one question, we're 20 or 30 others. Well, the flip side is just you will live longer if you join a couple of groups. I mean, honestly, that's a true fact, and that's, believe me, I'm now in the part of my life when I'm thinking about that. Rosemary and I are about to move into a continuing care requirement community, and the most important thing we looked at was the quality of community. Are we likely to have friends at this place, or do we already have friends at this place? And I do that because, I mean, I'm putting my money and my life where my mouth is here on this. I'm just going to live longer because Rosemary and I intentionally, she's better than I am, but intentionally make friends and join things to try to lengthen our lives. That's great. It's also fun, but so Ellen or somebody want to read out another question?
Dr. Rob Chamberlain has a question. He has his hand raised. He's one of our physician leaders. Rob,
okay.
Come on.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So thank you so much. And I so value this work, and I'm a huge believer in human connection. So I feel a little bit gun shy even asking this question. So at the risk of suggesting something anathema to human connection, I have some patients who are just isolated out there in their house that's kind of falling down. They can hardly drive anywhere. And I've been tempted to encourage them to download an AI bot friend to just have a conversation with something back and forth who is complimentary and can give them thought. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Well, first of all, I tend to be a data man, and I'm not only do I not know of serious evidence on that point, whether an AI bot is as good as as a hug from somebody. I doubt if anybody knows for sure that question. But I will say this: I'm sure it would be better if you just Zoomed with your grandchildren. I mean, that's, I'm stuck up in the woods. I'm sitting here in the middle of the woods in New Hampshire. I mean, I'm sure there are people someplace around here, but they're not visible to me. But I'm definitely like one that I've been almost all day today, and it's almost 1 o'clock. I've been on Zoom with somebody or other, and some of them were just, I was speaking to audiences like this, but I'm certain that I am actually now getting at least part of the good effect for connections by just looking at Dora and Barrett and so on. And you smile at that. I know that when you smile at me, that's giving me a little boost of the good stuff. So I think I'm not a huge fan of virtual connections, social media and so on, but that's a safer bet to me now than an AI bot.
Makes sense. And if anybody else has questions, just electronically raise your hand. We'd love to hear from you because that's more interactive than just me reading a question. But we do have Ed Pontius has a question about the Gilded Age and how that the accounts of the Gilded Age stress the concern of wealthy Americans that further increases in economic inequality would lead to general violence that would threaten them personally. So why aren't the majority of today's extremely wealthy Americans working to prevent instability, and harms threatening them? It sounds like wealthy Americans may not realize that this big disparity that you talked about, the big economic disparity, is a threat to stability.
No, they're so aware of it that they're pressing Congress right now to make the gap even bigger. I mean, it's just outrageous. Okay, it was true that John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie, late in their lives, came to have decent philanthropic impulses. I have to say it was late in their lives, and it was through their religious convictions. I think it's probably this, nearer my God to thee. The closer you get to death, the more like you're trying to hedge your bets, and maybe giving away your money is a good idea, but that hasn't happened yet. Of course, there are some notable exceptions. I mean, Bill Gates is an example. And for a while, it appears that the norm among rich folks in America today was becoming more philanthropic. But actually, that's even in the last 3 months, that's changed. I mean, it's just unbelievable. No rich folks are ashamed of being. I mean, I'd be ashamed of dying with a lot of money and leaving it all to my kids, and I'm not going to. Rosemary and I have arranged to set up a family foundation, which is, I'm not bragging, I'm just saying this is my sense of morals. We're not rich, of course we're not rich, but we've done okay, and we want to make sure that that money does not go to our kids are going to, and grandchildren are going to be fine, and they all agree this money should be given away to other folks. So that's just a simple moral question. Sorry to be self-centered in that, but it's embarrassing. They ought to be embarrassed to be pushing for even more money. What are they going to do with it?
That Joe Cuff has a question. Joseph.
Hi, thank you. My question revolves around birth rates, population, and demography. If you're able to talk a little bit about how the changing birth rate, specifically in the U.S. and with more older folk than younger folk, there currently are, and that's what the trend is looking like. How could that affect economics and politics and such moving forward?
Yeah, it's certainly going to. I mean, I'm not a specialist on demography, so I'm now giving you an informed layman's view about that. You're right. It is going to put a crimp because more and more of us are going to be depending on fewer and fewer of them. That is, more and more of us old folks are depending on, and that's yet another reason why we ought to be taxing of course, most elderly people are not rich, but there are some, and we ought to be paying more in taxes or less in Social Security. But it is going to be a problem without any doubt, and therefore it shows up in the debate about the national debt. There is a very clear example. This is not what you asked, but I want to at least indicate that I understand the issues of demography. Somebody else I saw in the chat line wanted to know about women, and wasn't the 60s a bad time for women and so on. This all goes back to Betty Friedan and her book about the isolated women in the suburbs, and they're being exploited by the men in their lives. Actually, there was a very specific generation of women who at least took a temporary hit to their income and working outside the home and so on. And that is the mothers of the baby boomers. The baby boom was so large that it required a lot of care, and especially care when they were infants. And this is long before there was anything systematic for daycare. And so that generation of women who happened to be caught in their childbearing years in the 1950s and 1960s did take a hit. They recovered most of it later on, but not all of it. But apart from that brief period where demography swamped other social trends, women have been more educated than men for at least the last 200 years. Let me repeat that. Women have been more educated than men for at least the last 20 years, and they're gaining on us. I mean, now the average woman now has, I've forgotten exactly, but it's something like 2 or 3 years more education than the average man. And of course, money doesn't follow directly from that, but it certainly does. And yeah, so demography has had an important effect there. That's, I know, not the case you're talking about. And I've given you the best answer I can, Joseph, to the question you asked.
Thank you. And Mary Wall, you've got a question.
Hi, thank you so much for presenting to us today. I think this is very fascinating. I just have a question. Is there any small change that everyone here can make today to help that line go back up? Or are there resources that we should all be looking for?
So
And thank you again.
small
Yeah.
changes, you were hard to hear, so I just going to repeat the
I
question.
got it.
Small changes that people could make.
I got it. It's a very, very good question. I tend to be operating at the 30,000 foot level and not be very good about giving answers, but I do think here's a couple of general points. Grassroots, it begins at the grassroots. Very important. And that means that's where we are. I mean, I go off talking to presidents, but that's not where the real change happened the last time, and it's not where it's going to happen this time. It's going to happen at the grassroots. Secondly, we haven't talked a little bit about different kinds of social capital, but it's important to have what I call bridging social capital. That is connections to different people unlike you. Nowadays, it's important to have connections with people who have different politics than you. And I know that Maine, like New Hampshire and most of the places in America, is really sharply divided, polarized in political terms. Now, some people think the way to answer that, the way to solve that is to get together and talk about the facts that we disagree. I don't think that's right, because I think if we talk about the facts that we disagree, on average, that's just likely to get us angrier. But we could talk about, this is the point I want to make, talk about start a group that's going to talk about some actual local problem in wherever you live, in Lewiston or God knows where, all these towns, or my little town here of Jaffrey. A problem here that and talk about that problem, because that's what we have in common. And just, the politics will take care of itself. Eventually, I'll discover that the guy who is, who's a Trump supporter, nevertheless agrees with me about a need for a new sewer in some part of town. Well, that's what's going to be bridging. So I think I would begin there. I'd begin also by thinking about education and young people. That's an area often, of course, there's a lot of debates about schools and so on, but fix on some, or just get involved in the life of some young kid. That is, there are a lot of things, given that it's the grassroots where this is going to happen. There are a lot of things we can do in our daily lives, especially you guys who are all well educated and have lots of social connections. You all got a lot of social capital, and you want to be sort of harnessing that social capital that you have. You may not think so, but you do have a lot of friends, and you have a lot of connections, and you should be able to harness that for improving, depolarizing life in your communities.
And you, in the movie Join or Die, which I highly recommend, I think you can get it on Netflix or something,
Yeah.
but you talk about just like joining a club, as you mentioned earlier, improves your health. Somebody else had their hand raised too to ask a verbal question. I don't know who it was because I don't see the hand raised anymore.
It was me, and I know we're at time, but I just was curious. You looked at the curve, and there was the I, we, and then it goes back to I. But I hear a lot in this conversation about the benefits to me about engaging with others versus, and that in some ways is still a selfish motive. If you're saying, well, you tell me to get involved with people because I'm going to live longer, versus, how do you motivate people to engage with others, whether or not it benefits them directly? And I think that's an interesting question, how to motivate people to do that for others.
So, Elizabeth, that's a great question, but I nevertheless have an answer to it. There are two different kinds of effects of social connections, of human connections. First of all, the effects on you, on me. My ties have great benefits for me. I live longer and so on. But there are also externalities, and I've talked about them here. There are effects of my social connections on other people. Most importantly, if I have more connections, well, let me give you a particular example. Much of the time we live in Cambridge, we happen to live in a neighborhood in which people are all the time having picnics and barbecues and ice skating parties and so on. And we know from the data that all those connections, all that social capital, is like building a magic plastic shield because it lowers crime rate, right? So high social capital, this is the factual matter, high social capital lowers the crime rate, causes the crime rate to go down because of eyes on the street and because people are looking out for one another and so on. And I'm benefiting from that right now, even though I'm not now in Cambridge. Our home in Cambridge is being protected by all that social capital that I'm never there. And it's not my social, I'm able to enjoy the benefits of it, but other people have created it. You see what I'm trying to say, Elizabeth? And the biggest example of that is democracy. My original work in this field showed that democracy will work better in a community in which there's a lot of social capital. That's the short version of this. This result has been confirmed by lots of other people. If you live in a town in which there's a lot of social capital, what town do you live in, Elizabeth?
South Portland.
Okay. Well, Chuck, who's also, I think, living in Chuck Morris, I think, is living in South Portland. I'm not sure about that, but he's living someplace up around Portland, and he tells me that a lot of social capital there. So you benefit from that, even if you yourself are a social isolate. And that's the main point I'm trying to make. So it's true, some people are going to be persuaded by the fact that they will be better off. And I think actually most people, they're going to hear that part of my talk and say, well, if I'm going to live longer, maybe I ought to join a few groups. But actually, for the we people in the audience, there's another good reason. Does that make sense, Elizabeth?
Yes, great answer. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Dr. Catherine Burgoyne has a question as well.
By the way, I love this stuff, so I will stay on here forever. But I know
We love. I was just going to say, you let us know when you need to leave. We'll keep going. This is just fascinating. So thank you. And Catherine, you just obtained your MPH, I think, too, right? So
yeah. So I wanted to mention that I read about how there are a lot of things that Americans actually agree on, and I put it in the chat, the link to the CBS News article. For instance, teacher pay should increase. Now, almost everyone agrees on that. There should be background checks on all gun purchases. There are a lot of things like that. And I have had a brother-in-law who was a Trump supporter. I didn't know what to talk to him about at family gatherings, so I brought this article and we talked about these things, and it was pretty fun. And I think the elephant in the room, in my view, is Citizens United and the fact that corporations can give unlimited campaign contributions. I really think that, we had, the NRA was supported by the gun manufacturers, and all of this gun stuff came out of a lot of that. I think if we could get rid of Citizens United, it would do a lot to improve our democracy.
There were two parts to that question, and the one I took notes on was the campaign finance, which I'd be glad to talk about. But what was the first part of the question? Was it's related, but it was a separate. Help me, somebody.
Well, the first part was that there are many things that most Americans agree on.
I got it. I got it. So two very good questions, and I'm now going to try to respond quickly to both of them. We take campaign finance first. I absolutely agree with that. And there's a lot of things to say about campaign finance that other people have said. Maybe it's hard to get it changed because it's hard to get the incumbents to agree to give up on that. They become addicted to the campaign financing they get from corporations. I do want to say that was exactly true in the progressive era that I talked about. One of the main reforms of that era was to institute strict campaign finance reform to overcome what? Corruption by big business of government. It's exact. I would say that only because that period that I'm talking about back there, it doesn't solve all of our problems, but they were able to solve exactly the same problems that we're trying to solve, and therefore I'm not going to now say in detail how to make that happen. What to happen is the same thing as they had laws against it, and those laws are still in the books. They're just not enforced. And then Citizens United overturned those laws. But it would pay a lot of attention to figuring out how did they make that happen. And then that goes back to what I was saying before. It was this grassroots movement, and a lot of people organizing across America led to that change. And that's, so I don't think I've ignored that. I mean, I'm calling attention to how I've already called attention to how the last time we faced that problem, we fixed it. And that's what we need now. It's that now the issue of, is it us or is it the guys up at the top who are causing the problem? That's the question essentially you're asking me. We all agree, but how come the country is polarized? There is actually a big empirical debate. Sorry, I'm a political scientist, so now I'm going to give you a little look at the literature. There's a big debate in political science about, the short version of it is top down or bottom up. And there are those people who say that the politicians are polarized just because we're polarized, and they're just going where they're going where the votes are, at one pole or the other. And there are serious, political scientists whom I respect who hold that view. And you have to go down deep into the data to try to figure out how you solve that problem. And it's probably a little bit of both, probably part down, probably part bottom up, and partly top down. But there is another view, which I hold and which people whom I respect hold, that actually, which is very much along the lines of the article in CBS, I think you said, or in fact, it's so much along that line that I bet that if you went through the footnotes to that article in CBS, they quoted the guy named Mo Fiorina, because he's used exactly that same data to say we agree on all these things. So why do we think we disagree? It's because they up there, the political leaders, are foisting this disagreement on us. And in a way, it doesn't much matter if it's us. Well, how do we fix that? But if it's them, how do we fix them? And I'm not trying to say the issue you're raising is unimportant. It's very important. But if you get to the, okay, so what do we do about it? I'm both the points you mentioned, that is the polarization, who caused it, and the campaign finance, in my mind, lead back to the basic question of, so how do we get out of this trap that we're in which everything is causing everything else? Does that make sense? You may not agree with me, Catherine, but does that make sense?
Yes, yeah.
I'm trying my best to answer your questions. Dora, can you arrange for the next question to be an easy question? Because you guys not having questions?
I'd like to ask a verbal question. I don't see the other hands raised electronically, but just unmute.
We lost our audience, which is
there was a good, interesting question about religion and the impact of religion in the trends you were talking about.
Which seems to have gone both ways, right, Bob? I mean, it seems like some aspect in America has been polarizing and some hasn't. I don't know.
Hold on. Once again, you keep asking all these easy questions. I've written a whole book about religion and this. So which is a huge book. I don't know if I got a copy of it here. It's an enormous book, like 500 or 600 pages. And you now expect me to summarize in the next 60 seconds, 600 pages. So I'm going to do it telegraphically. One, and this is really important. It's a true fact, and it's one reason why I get more invitations to speak from religious groups than from secular groups, and that's because I've found out this true fact, which is religious folks are nicer than other people. That's the technical term. What I mean by that is controlling for everything you can imagine. Controlling for how old people are and I don't know, their emotional stability and so on, all those things you can control for. People who are more religious are more likely to help old people across the street, more likely to give to charity, and not just in the offering plate, but give to the Red Cross. They're more likely to volunteer, and not just to volunteer as church ushers, but also to volunteer, for the Little League. They're more likely to work on community projects. I mean, I've got a list of 15 different things that they might do, and religious people always rank higher on that. That's the first point. And not only that, but becoming more religious, because we interview people at several different points in time, we can see them becoming more religious, and then they become nicer. So it's very likely to be causal. But what is it about religion? That's the second point that's really important. It turns out it's not going to church, or it's not believing in God. It's whether you are part of some community inside the church. You go to church suppers, for example, or you belong to what Jewish congregations often call Havurah, which are little small groups. That's really so strong that I can show you in the data. If you are an atheist, but go to church suppers. Now you may ask, how can an atheist go to church suppers? Answer: spouses. So somebody's, they don't believe in God at all, but they do go to church suppers. You turn out to be nicer than the most devout person who prays every day, devoutly believes in God, but prays alone and never goes to the church suppers. It's the church suppers, not the belief in God, that matter. It's a really interesting finding. And church suppers matter more than the Rotary Club. Church religion, here's the bottom line of this part of what I want to say. Being involved in a religious community, not believing in God, but being involved in a religious community is like supercharged. It's even better than belonging to a Rotary Club. So that has gotten my, don't interrupt me yet, Dora, because it's a 600-page word of the book, and I'm trying to give you the highlights. That is a true fact. That's why, and of course, religious people really love me when I say that. However, not all religious people and not all religions are alike, and so there is about a tenth of all Americans, which is a lot of people, of course, but it's still only a tenth, are religious true believers. That is, they really believe in God and they go to church all the time, and they are very intolerant. And you can see that in the data. It's a tiny minority of religious people. And you've got to keep saying that, because among the secular progressive side of America, we all think that all religious people are like that, and they're not. Most religious people are very decent people. I mean, I suppose I'm a little bit religious. We do belong to a synagogue and so on, but I'm not. But first of all, I'm not a Christian, so I'm not even part of this discussion really in America. But in general, religious it's like a poison. I mean, some things you guys know in medicine, there are some medicines you could take that are really great, but if you take it a little too much of it, it's fatal. Come on, Dora, or some MD there. Give me an example of that fits that. And I know there are
Tylenol is very healthy, but if healthful and health. Oh my gosh, helpful, but you take much of it, it's very toxic.
For me, I should have thought of that. I have a kidney problem, and I was taking for a long time. I was taking ibuprofen, and it turned out to be my doctor now tells me that caused the kidney problem. So okay, and that's religion is like that. Take it in moderate doses. It's good for your civic health. But there's this tenth of the population that are just taking overdosing on it, and they're very toxic for our body politic. I could go on because religion is a nice. And I can't remember actually whether I said. Maybe not. I'll finish with this. I told you about the religion being, or culture, morals being the leading indicator of when America got better in the 1880s, 1890s. Maybe I did tell you about this. That is, it began among evangelical Protestants. The upturn began among evangelical Protestants who said, read the damn Sermon on the Mount. Did we talk about this? Honestly, I can't remember whether we did.
You mentioned it, but not in any detail. So this is great.
So now, I'm not saying that only religious people can be nice. That's obviously false. And I was one of the people who discovered that young people in America are flooding out of churches, basically flooding out of churches because they believe that churches are politicizing. that religion has become really just about politics. That's not true for most people who are religious, but it's what gets the headlines, and lots of other young people say, if that's what religion is about, I'm out of here. I don't want to have, I get too much politics anyhow. So there's a lot of misunderstanding here. I guess the takeaway is, I think, if I could put it this way, that religious people in America are on the side of the angels. That's a pun. Meaning they could help us a lot, but they need to get more active, and somehow we need to kind of, I don't know, we can't mute them, but disregard this intolerant tenth. That's a complicated story. I'm sorry, Dora, to take so long over it, but I'm trying to convey a nuanced view. We're not just about good guys and bad guys, or good men and good women in America. It's facts help.
Yeah. Now this has been an incredible hour and 15 minutes or so. I mean, this is just very stimulating conversation, and I know you are really a hot ticket for people you get a lot of speaking engagements, and you only say yes to about one in 100 or so. So we are extraordinarily blessed to have you with us today at MaineHealth. Thank you very, very much. And David Spalding is saying he's going to listen to the recording several times, and I know I'm going to listen to it again as well. It's just